Racism in global development is a problem. It is a deep systemic issue.
We like to measure things in global development, but while there are many indices measuring gender equality in the sector, there are none focused on measuring racial equity. The Racial Equity Index is the very first index to measure racial equity in global development and hold the sector accountable for dismantling the systemic racism it was created to uphold.
We are a BIPOC-led collective.
We are global.
We are anti-racist.
Together, we collectively have over 50 years of experience working in the sector.
Every single person in our collective has experienced racism in global development.
The Racial Equity Index is groundbreaking and innovative, and will serve as a metric for the sector in order to reduce harm and make meaningful impact in areas of racial equity.
Success looks like racial equity intentionally incorporated and integrated by organizations in a sustained manner.
Success looks like permanently shifting the dialogue around racial equity in the sector, recognizing that racial inequity and injustices sit at the root of global development.
Success looks like dismantling of systemic racism in global development, and instead creating a more just and equitable sector.
Success looks like more Black, Indigenous, and people of color in senior roles across the sector.
We are
the Racial Equity Index.
I can see you all. Hello. Lovely to see you all. I don't know if all of you have been in the first session, but welcome back to our 2-year anniversary event. We still need to talking truth on racial equity in global development. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Lena Biru, and I am part of the working group of the Racial Equity Index. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this event and this session on behalf of the entire Racial Equity Index collective today. I am a Mauritian, brown-skinned, blonde, brownie, curly-haired woman, and I am wearing a blue top in a black seat, and you can see a smiley emoji face over my right shoulder there. I'll start with a little bit of scene setting for those of you who might not have caught everything about the Racial Equity Index in the first session. So the Racial Equity Index was formed by a dedicated global group of BIPOC people who wanted to explore the lack and the need for a racial equity index in the global development sector. Since July 2020, we have been and currently are all volunteers. And this event that you are participating in today is happening purely due to the sweat equity of our BIPOC-led collective. So we want to take a moment to thank all of you who have turned up, who have bought tickets and sponsored tickets and given donations. This has made the event possible. And because of all of your support, we've been able to give away 10 free tickets to this event. So thanks very much for that. We also want to thank our fiscal sponsor, More Impact, for their continued support. A few things just as we start this session. This is a wholly anti-racist space, meaning we will not tolerate racism or harm of any kind. Any person who violates this will promptly be removed and their ticket fee will not be refunded. In any case of Zoom bombing, we will do our best to ensure the individual is removed, and we may close the session if we need to, and if we need to restart, we will communicate with you all and make sure it's as safe as possible when we come back. We will have questions throughout this session, so if a question does come to mind, please do submit them onto our Jamboard, which I can pop into the chat, or magically maybe it might happen. Otherwise, I'll do it. We've got there we go. We've got a Jamboard there, so you can just move to slide 2 and use a post-it to pop any questions that might come to mind. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout this session. And finally, we have closed captioning available for all participants. So you can turn this on by using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. The closed captioning is automated, so it's about 80% accurate, but won't take into account accents or non-Eurocentric language, of course. Seems right, doesn't it? We also acknowledge the fact that due to having limited capacity, we are not able to offer any translational sign language for this event. So This session that we're going to go into is really interesting, and I'm really excited to hear and learn more about it. As with most things that you might have heard already about racism and how it shows up in the sector, these topics can be really heavy, distressing, and triggering. And so if you do find yourself sitting with some resistance or feeling triggered, please do move away, take time out, like go for a walk, get out in the air if you need to, do what you need to look after yourself. This session will be recorded, and I have spoken enough now. So without further delay, I am going to hand over to the two speakers for this session. It's called Resisting Everyday Oppression in Aid. So I'm really excited to learn more from Monica and Nabila. So over to you both.
Hi, everyone. I'm gonna leave it in this view because if I do the other view, I cannot see you and it's a bit chaotic for me. So I'd like, please bear with the Zoom technology there. So my name is Monica Mukerjee. I'm a South Asian Indian woman born in the United States. I'm brown skinned. I have dark wavy hair. I have pink lipstick on because, man, we all need some more color in our lives. My background is blurred, but it is hiding my messy bedroom. So please, no pretense here, coming at you real life. Professionally, for who I am, I've worked in the aid sector for the last 10, 11 years or so, and I'm a mental health and psychosocial specialist and a violence response specialist. Most recently, I was with Médecins Sans Frontières. I've been with the International Committee of the Red Cross, Médecins du Monde, and some local grassroots organizations as well. And during the course of my work, although I was supposed to be working on violence and how it affects communities, it has just been increasingly obvious and impossible to ignore that violence is enacted and enabled by the aid sector itself. And that has taken me on a journey where I have been involved with the group you may have heard of called Decolonize MSF. Decolonize MSF is unaffiliated with the organization. It was started organically by a group of current and former staff who want to hold the organization to account and eradicate the ongoing abuse and discrimination we see every day. So I've been part of a number of actions that Decolonize MSF has taken, including co-authoring a report that was released last year called Dignity at MSF. And it featured a survivor-led survey of abuse and discrimination that we chose to do because the institution wouldn't. So in that process, that is how I met my very, very good friend, Nabila. Together, we've been mobilizing and trying to figure out how we can support survivors. And that's how I also joined NANSHE, which she is going to talk more about. Nabila.
Hi. Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. So my name is Nabila Nasir. I am Southeast Asian of Chinese Javanese descent. I am wearing a floral top and I have curly hair. My hair is behaving today, but most days I look like a lion. I spent 15 years in the aid and development sector, primarily in resource mobilization, partnerships, advocacy type roles. I started my career as a political activist in my home country, which is Malaysia. And then I worked in various organizations, including International Planned Parenthood Federation, UNFPA, and then my last position was at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, also known as IFRC. While I was working at IFRC Nairobi as head of partnerships for Africa region, I was sexually assaulted by a colleague, and I was massively betrayed by the institution that was meant to protect me in the aftermath of the reporting. So after like horrendous 6 to 8 months period, and then was told that, you know, I still have my job, but all I have to do is go back to Nairobi and work next to my perpetrator. I said, thank you, but no thank you. And then I used my skills and privilege and I became a whistleblower. I started speaking to media and donors about my experience and all of the gaps in the aftermath of the reporting, and then the ostracization, the retaliation, the flat shaming. And that was how NANSHE was founded, because NANSHE was named after the Sumerian goddess of social justice. When I went public, a lot of survivors contacted me. And, you know, I was trying to organize like support groups between all of the survivors, but I was just one tiny person in Malaysia battling across time zones. So NANSHE was founded, and it's basically a tech nonprofit that is creating a community of support for survivors specific to the sector. And obviously, in the longer term, we aim to shift the dynamics of accountability of organizations in the sector, you know, instead of being so organizational driven in processes and putting the power back in the hands of survivors. Very, very proud to say that it's been a year and a half, but earlier this year, NANSHE was a finalist for the Echoing Green Fellowship. We didn't get through, but we know that the road is long and that we continue to have faith in the work that we do.
So today we're going to talk about resistance. We're going to talk about how a lot of the frustration we feel and exhaustion that those of us who are trying to demand change fits into a wider movement that's been going on for decades before many of us were born, of resistance. And we know it's been an intense 2 years. Nabila, can you see? No?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, so what you see here basically are all the news headlines that are within the last 2 years. So you can see on the screen, it's sexual abuse in the aid sector still widespread. They did nothing to protect me. That one is mine, I think. Survivor questions IFRC's zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment. Toxic workplaces, human rights organizations, some of the culprits. And so, you know, understandably, even though this conversation had affected other sectors, and this conversation actually has been happening much, much earlier, ours was a little bit slower to be brought to the discourse. I think even the Catholic Church got there before us. So, you know, we can all imagine the exhaustion for those of us that are demanding, or at least can still envision change, i.e. not yet jaded.
So a lot of these headlines are clearly about oppression. So let's take a minute and talk about what we mean by oppression. So oppression is the combination of prejudice and institutional power that creates this system that regularly and severely discriminates against some groups and benefits others. The groups that are benefiting tend to benefit from what we call supremacy, and there are different facets of supremacy. I think what's interesting is that for a lot of us who are demanding change, it's easy to focus on one aspect of supremacy, but they're interlinked. So if we look on the side, we have a black hydra, which this metaphor has been adapted by Tom Arcaro, who describes a hydra of oppression, basically that we see how patriarchy, cis heteronormativity, neocolonialism, racism, classism, ableism, ageism, and many, many other facets of supremacy are interlinked. And we can focus on trying to slash one head, but overall what we're looking at is a number of privileging forces that enable what we'd call toxic othering. Distinguishing a group that is othered, that is decided as different than the dominant group. And overall, what we want to see in the aid sector when we talk about change is dismantling this. Since we're a small group, I mean, maybe we can take a minute. When we think of what this kind of oppression looks like, what we're trying to change concretely, can anyone think of some examples and maybe leave them in the chat of just some of the everyday manifestations of what oppression means or looks like? Maybe something you've witnessed or experienced. I don't know if we're getting anything in the Jamboard. For the jam, okay, for in the chat. So blatant disregard for LGBTIQ rights in the language that is used by HR. I'd say for myself, pay inequity that we see across different groups, abuse, harassment inside of teams, labor conditions is a big one. What are some other examples? The language as ableism. Yeah, I think that we see different accommodations made with the assumption that everyone is equally able-bodied, not thinking of the different ways that our bodies can present. Limiting access to opportunity and visibility. Women not being credited for their work and being paid less for undertaking the same jobs. Black women being stereotyped as the angry Black woman and facing hair discrimination. Standardizing processes across different global contexts. And I'd imagine what we mean when we standardize that, it is based around a Western hegemonic norm, not taking into account the other norms that exist. So that's great. Of course, and an almost all white European leadership board being appointed in a global aid organization. I would say we have quite a few aid organizations that story could apply to. So yeah, so these are some great examples, and there are many, many more when we're thinking of what are we actually trying to dismantle and how does this look in our everyday.
Which brings us then to the next question, right? Which is what is resistance? According to Tamara Fakhuri, which is who's a researcher and philosopher specializing in oppression and resistance, resistance to oppression involves, at the very least, pushing back against oppressive forces in the face of known risk. So, resistors don't need to have any sophisticated theoretical knowledge of oppression and resistance, but they would know that there are social forces banning or discouraging their behavior in any setting that they're in. Choosing to violate those social forces is risky, and it's a reason for them not to do it, but resistors are motivated to discount or dismiss what reason, that reason, and act instead on other reasons that favor what oppression bans or discourages. That is a very minimal requirement of an act of resistance. And again, because we're such a intimate group today, like, would you guys like to share like what your idea of a resistance, or maybe something that you have done to resist everyday oppression in your workplace? So I'll go first. I spoke out against, when I was still working at this happened at the UN. I had a very close colleague who identifies as a gay man, and then he was saying something, I don't know, maybe rather flamboyantly, and then he was made fun of by HR, and I reported that incident. Because I wanted it. I wasn't sure whether there was anything that was going to be done about it, but I wanted to ensure that that it was on record. Does anybody else have any input of an act of resistance that they have done or that they know other people have done before? If you can type it in the chat, sorry, or put it in the Jamboard. Am I even on the Jamboard? Yes, I'm in. Rest. Yeah, that's that's a very, very good input, because our sector is because according to our sector we have infinite amount of energy. We don't need holidays. Supporting people to reset to their normal. Yeah. Anybody else?
Raised our
so
voices.
like a petition, like an in-house petition. Yeah, that will. So we will be exploring some of that in this presentation. All the kinds of resistance that everybody may or may not know of. Some are a bit more obscure, some that even Monica and I discovered while in the process of, preparing for this presentation, and had a lot of fun and was very impressed and wowed in that process. Monica, do you want to take over from there?
Yeah. So in the course of our work, Nabila and I have met hundreds of survivors from different organizations and survivors of various forms of oppression and violence. And when we think of the forms of resistance that people have exerted, we see that it's a spectrum. And that these areas, I mean, even though the diagram shows a double-headed arrow for the sake of, your eyes and some ease here, in reality, we see all kinds of combinations of resistance. So it might be that it's an individual who's exerting resistance, or it might be that a collective group is. It might be that the action is done inside an organization or inside a space. It might be that it's done outside. It might be that an action is attempting to be persuasive, to lobby to those inside or in key decision makers of a space, or it may be that the action is intending to disrupt business as usual, to stop an activity from happening. And it may be that something is done quietly, that it's not always visible, that it's not always broadcast, and it may also be that some things are done loudly. So what's really important is that all of these facets are at play in what we've seen happen over the last 2 years. But sometimes some of them come to our attention more because resistance is also shaped by supremacy. Our idea of what resistance is very much impacted by white supremacy, by patriarchy, and what we recognize as legitimate change. So it's really important that we take a moment and actually acknowledge that there are many, many different forms of change, and that we think about some of these because maybe we might recognize we are exerting more resistance than we've realized. So let's go to some examples. So let's talk about what we've seen some individuals do. Nabila gave a great example of raising a formal complaint. And as she acknowledged, it wasn't only because she thought justice would come through the formal complaint, it was also the process of seeing what the system would do. So we've seen a number of people who've also made formal complaints with the intention of exposing weaknesses in a reporting system. We know of survivors who have begun to take legal actions against the sector. These tend not to be broadcast again because of the non-disclosure agreements and the obvious desire to hide these kinds of things. But indeed, we do have colleagues who are suing different actors in the sector. We know of people who've begun to refuse assignments and resign. I think what came up as some of the suggestions about self-care, rest. We have seen people increasingly begin to take up and prioritize their own care. One of my favorite examples that happens a lot is people who have sought psychological help outside of their employer system. In fact, even if they look for either affordable mechanisms or free services, in fact, so that way their employer will not know they're receiving this care because they're worried it might affect their career. We know of a number of survival, harm reduction, and negotiation strategies individuals are taking up. We know of people who are doing things like negotiating their pay up or down. I know of a few people who've actually requested to be paid less because they feel that their local colleagues should be paid more. These, again, are not broadcast because we usually don't talk about pay in the sector, but this is happening. And probably what's interesting is the behavior change all of us are taking up. For myself, I can say that I think a lot about language. So I'm really working hard to not use the word mission because the organizations I've worked in tend to say mission. And it is not because of a DEI vocabulary list that I'm making this change. The point of these actions are that they are individuals, regardless of what the institution is doing. People are taking it up upon themselves to begin to push the needle on where the organization should go. And then this picture here from Can't Buy My Silence is another example I love. Can't Buy My Silence is a global campaign against non-disclosure agreements, which are being used all over the world across industries to try to hide wrongdoing by entities. So if you check out Can't Buy My Silence's website, you will find that there is a way that you can write a letter. They have a template to be released from your non-disclosure agreement. And we know of a number of aid workers who have begun to submit this letter. And while it has not led to change, it is already an act of resistance. As you know, if you have ever signed a contract with certain employers, you do sign your life away. To actually be able to resist back, even after you've signed, to say, no, I want to be released, is something that I think the sector has not been prepared for. So, survey and data collection. The report I talked about is a great example by Decolonize MSF. So we basically put together a survey of questions that mattered to us. We chose language that mattered to MSF, and we asked people that we knew the institution had not regularly been engaging with, namely former staff, namely people who had been affected by abuse and discrimination. We also tried to ask communities to understand what the experience was. We're not the only ones doing this. Like, as our hosts, Racial Equity Index, this effort to try to measure racism, to actually understand what the problem is a key part of resistance, where if the problem cannot be named, if it cannot be seen, we can't begin to have activities. Actually beginning to have an index is an act of resistance. I'm also aware of many individuals and projects who have begun doing their own surveys. These, again, are not always advertised. I know of a group who, in response to unfair wages, began to collect data in their location on the cost of living, using things like electricity, food costs, to measure against institutional benchmarking. So they already were prepared with the database. When they received the official answer of what their wage should be and how much it should be increased, they came prepared with their own database, so that way they could hold this to account. So measurement, even though it can be problematic because it does reinforce certain norms in the sector, it can also be a tool of resistance we're seeing many take up. Mutual aid. So I think this one is one of my favorites because it just feels so natural for those of us who are helpers. If we have resources, we try to give and share if we can, and that may be in the form of donating funds. In some cases, we know of crowdfunding for colleagues who are in discriminatory situations. We also know of people who are suffering distress, and the donation of funds so people can sustain their whistleblowing, so people can receive care, even though the institution tries to maintain an unequal system, is very important, and it is happening. We're aware of individuals who are donating their expertise, often unofficially. Like, we have, Nabila and I have a number of good lawyer friends who continue to donate their work and giving their advice for all of the actions that we do. We also have mental health colleagues. We have comms professionals. We have a number of people who are using their professional skills and choosing to donate them for the causes that we're talking about today. And lastly, even if you don't have a professional expertise, many of us have a lived experience expertise, and providing that knowledge to one another has been a big change we've seen in the last 2 years. Giving advice on who can be trusted, who are key resources, what are things that we can be doing. The number of times I've had someone recommend someone else to me to talk to. This has been happening over and over again, and it is a form of mutual aid. Letter writing. I'd say I'm almost sick of letters at this point, but they are a very, very big part of what we've seen in the last 2 years. Decolonize MSF had a letter that you may have seen. International Rescue Committee had a very public letter as well. Action Aid UK had a letter in a statement. And then there also have been a number of letters that were not external. A number of internal letters that stayed in-house that we are also aware of. This one by WFP is a good example where coverage of the letter happened, even though the letter was not public. It was in response to this tweet. This happened recently in March 2022. WFP tweeted a picture of the team in Ukraine You will notice from the example, this tweet has now been deleted, but it is an all-white group of men who have been deployed in Ukraine, and more than 250 employees, mostly women, signed a letter saying that the agency has fallen short of its pledges to promote greater gender equality and diversity. And I think that a number of us have seen letters like this in our institutions. I'm aware of some in the Red Cross movement. I'm aware of other letters in UNHCR. And I think letters are going to continue to be a big part of the change process we see, because it's a good way of actually creating a narrative of what we would like to say isn't happening and is happening, and also to show signatures and show actual support. But one of my favorite examples, though, is when we get out of words and we get into physicality. So I don't know if any of you are aware of the child sexual abuse scandal that happened at Mercy Corps. Tanya Culver Humphrey, who is the daughter of the co-founder of Mercy Corps, her father had sexually abused her as a child. And over 2 decades, she attempted to disclose and raise her allegations. And it was only until 2019 that the board began to take these concerns seriously, in part because of an external investigation and staff mobilization. So as the board and leadership began to deny, again, what had happened to her, what a credible act happened was that staff began to leave messages outside of the Mercy Corps office in chalk. And there was a moment when she went to go visit to read the messages, and staff heard, and they came out of their office to stand with her. So this is a picture from that event. You'll see that there are like a big group of people outside of a building, but it's a moment which I think it really means a lot, especially in this virtual moment with the pandemic, of literally to stand with someone and to show that you were there. There was a lot of apology. There was a lot of appreciation for her. And if you want to look into it, you can actually see some video from the event online. And it's just a lot of tears and recognition after 2 decades of being ignored, of staff saying that they appreciated Tanya and for what she did, and that they were disgusted that more had not been done before, and that they want change to come forward. I hand over to you, Nabila.
Thanks. Okay, so because I am a fan of sarcasm and using a sense of humor, especially in uncomfortable situations, satire is my favorite form of resistance. And here are 2 examples of resistance using satire. The first one being Barbie Savior. It's an Instagram account that follows Barbie in Africa, running an NGO that provides drinking water to locals. The tagline for her organization that she's with is harnessing broken white hearts to provide water to those in Africa 1 tear at a time. In the Instagram account throughout, she refers to Africa as a country, how she is at one with people of her favorite country. In one of the posts that she caught malaria and refused to get medical help. And you can see from the photo on the presentation, it's like, you know, Barbie wearing the kitenge or trying to be at one with the locals, as she describes in her captions. And then, you know, she always said that, oh, she doesn't want to use her white privilege. And then one day she was forced to be medevaced out of for medical attention. And another one where she takes I think that's the one on the stream. She says, oh, taking a slumpy, feeling blessed. And then so basically this account shows, like, you know, the very problematic practice of volunteerism, is that how you pronounce it? And how ineffective they are, and this account has been covered by various international media because it's hilarious, and it's my favorite one. Whenever I'm down, whenever I feel like doing this work is defeating me, I just go to this website, I just go to this account, and it cheers me up instantly. Another example of satire is the Empire Tweets Back, which hashtag Humanitarian Star Wars. And it's a Twitter account posting memes critiquing the aid sector. So the memes are often set in like Star Wars galaxy, but with issues that are pertinent, or sorry, that are prevalent in the aid sector. Like for example, this one, there is one. We posted three memes on the presentation, and one of the memes that we shared is, it says that despite its progressive ethos, the rebel alliance pays Wookiees at local staff rates. And then another one says, the empire's biggest mistake was not offering better livelihood programs to rural youth on Tatooine. So yeah, so these are the two of my favorite satirical acts of resistance, and they always cheer me up whenever I am, feeling a little bit defeated.
Nabila, what was the account again?
It's Empire tweets back here, hashtag, if you click hashtag Humanitarian Star Wars on Twitter. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. And another example of resistance is using art. When I first started my career, I mentioned I started my career as a political activist in Malaysia. Art is another form of my favorite resistance as well. When I first started, we in a very oppressive authoritarian environment, and at the national level, we created art, to speak out against the government. And so we created, I remember going to a really famous area where a lot of parliamentarians hang out at, and doing graffitis, for example. And I find that art can be pretty, controversial and effective in that sense, because it's very visual. And this is another one. This is the one that both Monica and I found, and we just got sidetracked by it. It's called The Lion and the Tales of the Lion and the Giraffe, and it's created by 8 development workers working in Africa region. And basically this series, the Tales of the Lion and the Giraffe is an actual tale, but they basically adapted it into the into context of issues that is again prevalent in the sector, such as sexism, racism, nepotism, etc. Another example of resistance is sharing stories. This is sharing stories by in the 8-2 movement. So the hashtag 8-2 movement spun out from the hashtag #MeToo movement. And basically it created space and opportunities for women to share their stories of harassment, abuse, and discrimination. These are examples of stories that are shared on the slides. For example, are quotes that were shared within NANSHE's network of survivors, which we then had consent to create as posters, and we shared them on Twitter using the hashtag 8-2, and as well as other social media platforms to contribute to the 8-2 discourse. The one that's on the screen says, "Trust the system," they said, the system failed me. And then after the investigation, I was asked to return to the same posting. The perpetrator was still around. And I think what was very powerful about this is that these are not, but "trust the system," they said, "the system failed me," was my quote, but a lot of the survivors said that they felt like it could have been them. And then this other quote is not my quote. Right after the investigation, I was asked to return to the same posting. That could have well been my quote as well, because the same thing that happened to me. So it created a sense of solidarity, a sense of common ground between survivors, and it gave people the courage to. It gave a lot of after this campaign, it gave a lot of women the courage to contact NANSHE. For which we're very, very grateful for their courage, and to share with us further and to get involved with NANSHE and help other survivors. Which brings us to the next slide, which is another example of resistance is creating communities of support. And NANSHE, as mentioned in our introduction, is a community of support for women who are facing harassment, abuse, discrimination of any kind, sexual or not. But it actually, it's not the first of its kind. It's the first of its kind as a tech nonprofit, and specifically for women. But within organizations in the sector and on social media, there's been like lots of efforts to create pockets of small communities so that people will have somewhere to turn to and a place for solidarity and common ground, right, to discuss issues. So for example, Decall MSF, Racial Equity Index in some ways are also creating communities of support through their collective, by holding spaces for people and colleagues in the sector. A lot of the time when people go through distress or if they report wrongdoing, and they're often told not to discuss it, they are told to keep it confidential. As a result, there is this sense of extreme isolation, and thereafter sometimes there is also retaliation, and then from there, social ostracization. After I reported my case, I felt extreme loneliness because people that I considered best friends or families, right? Because you're working together in hard duty stations, people that you shared secrets with, people that you fed their cats when they go on holidays, suddenly not talking to you anymore, and obviously that creates this sense of struggle, right? And the thing is, why should we stay quiet and not talk to each other? Because why do we want to abide by the confidentiality rules that harm us further if that confidentiality only serves the purpose of protecting the organizations and the perpetrators that they protect? So as part of the NANSHE work, we are organizing a survivors forum. As we said, we want to be able to change the dynamic of being, the process being so organizationally driven, and then survivors are only treated, they're only good for their stories most of the time, when even with donors, oh yeah, we'll have listening exercises, and then after that listening exercises, they tell survivors or people who are affected by the issues, thank you for your story, bye. And for us to be able to shift that power dynamics that is just so heavily seen in the sector, we want to be able to bring all of the survivors from different organizations at all different levels together. And so we are organizing a forum that will start on the 21st of July, where survivors will be invited to put their heads together, discuss on the changes that on the changes that they want to see that would put survivors' expertise at the front and center, and recognizing that they're more than just their stories. We're currently accepting the signups for women working in the sector, and we're open to both survivors and allies. So the chat is on the screen, but we will also share it in the link in the chat.
So yeah.
Okay.
So that's a lot of examples we've given, which I think can be a bit mind-bending, because after the last 2 years, I know the feeling I have in my heart that Nabila and I talk a lot about is, what the heck has happened after all of this effort of trying to call out and ask and demand and change things? Have we done anything? So we wanted to share a few of our reflections on the difficult truths about resistance, because it can clearly sound on paper like a great thing, but we know very well in reality it's not easy. For instance, one thing that both Nabila and I have witnessed and experienced is a lack of solidarity, particularly between different groups. In focusing on one certain issue, there's a tendency then to get narrow visioned. And there's also a tendency to sometimes support formal causes rather than to think of how we live and interact in the everyday with one another. I think Chantal was bringing this up in her session, right, of how we treat each other is as important, and in our experience, even more important than if you put your signature just on a piece of paper. If you are racist in your everyday behavior, it doesn't matter what you sign or what you post on social media, right? Like, we all try to work out if you're actually with us. Yeah, and another thing is that these forms of resistance, they clearly can conflict with each other, right? So one person who says, look, my act of resistance is that I need rest right now, that I need to protect myself, that I need self-care, that can feel at times like it is in conflict with somebody who's like, look, I need you to support me and I need you to be out there with me because I'm alone. We also see this in terms of, do we work on internal change or do we ask for external accountability? These forms of resistance, they're out there, they coexist, and they are in tension with one another. And it's really important that we see that and recognize that. I'll leave the second half to you, Nabila, but the other thing is that when you start an action, I think you begin with an idea of what you want to accomplish and an understanding of the risks, but they become very different as you go forward. That fear of retaliation somewhere halfway through, or as you begin something, or when you thought it was going to end, but it continues. I can say for myself, working on the report, I expected a certain amount of retaliation at certain stages. And then I found retaliation at different points. Making sure that I had what I needed to be able to continue with my activism was very difficult. I was very exhausted by this, and I did feel abandoned at certain moments because I couldn't foresee how long some of that pushback might be that I'd get for doing that.
Another thing that that is quite hard for a lot of us who are doing the work, especially if you're resisting at the very forefront. It gets very frustrating because you're just one person and you cannot do everything. Like, no one can do everything on their own, right? And then there will be moments when you feel like you will let others down, because that you've reached a point where you just feel like you've reached your limit and you need to take like a few days off, and then you feel like in those moments you're letting others down by saying no. And also that others will let you down in for example, in the ways that Monica has said, or if you had expectations to do something together with either partner organization or with colleagues in an informal way, and then they bail on you last minute because of the fear of retaliation halfway through. So I think it will put you in a very difficult, struggling headspace. Like, oh my God, why am I doing this? Should I just give up? Like, what is it? Like, what's it going to change anyway, right? And another thing is that I think we also have to be very aware that somehow supremacy shapes how we see resistance and who is enacting the resistance, right? So so for example, there was, I think Monica shared with me that there was a paper done on the 8-2 discourse, and how a lot of the women who are sharing their stories on Twitter, not through an organization like NANSHE, but them personally sharing their stories, are women who are white and from the global north, because they do have the privilege, or they have the job security, right? So for example, when even before I went public with my story in the Red Cross, I just reported it institutionally, and it was leaked. People started coming to my office, and I remember this very well. There was an intern, and she said that at the bottom of her heart, she knows that she wants to report, but she just can't because she's an intern. And she says, you are the head of partnerships, and you reported and look what happened to you. So how can I, as an intern who's just about to start my career, do this myself, right? But yeah, so these are the kind of difficult truths about resistance that I think some of us need to be aware of while we're doing it. And like, I know myself and also Monica, we constantly have to check in with each other to remind ourselves that these are the complexities of resistance, right? Monica, you want to add anything?
No, I want to leave time for us to discuss together because I think I imagine everyone in the room has a lot to offer and share and also think about. So if you have nothing to bring to the table, we also leave these questions with you. In the face of so much harm and unfairness, I think it's really easy to go into, like, actually I'd say aid worker mode, crisis mode, firefighting mode, to just continue to go and try to solve problems as they appear to us. In that kind of culture, reflecting and imagining what we want change to look like, what the world could actually be if it were more equitable, if respect was there, if we allowed other cultures to have moments to permeate instead of what currently dominates. That is an act of resistance. So we've left some questions here. If you feel brave, you can use the hashtag #LiberatingAid. If you feel like keeping it in this space, we can keep it here. And you can also put your faux tweets if you just want to practice. But some of the questions that we also think are acts of resistance are reflecting on, if aid was free of oppression, what would it look like to you? How would you know it was gone? Like, if you woke up tomorrow and oppression was gone, what's the first sign you would know? What would disappear? What would appear? What would exist instead? So we leave that with you, and we can discuss that, or we can discuss any questions you have about our presentation.
Thank you so much, Monica and Nabila. Really, really interesting presentation, and I learned a lot. I really liked that point on mutual aid. All those examples of resistance were incredible, and I never really thought of that. Actually connecting and being connected to other people is also kind of a like mutual aid. I really, really like that one. But I just wanted to leave some time for some questions that we have got. So I can, I think I can share my screen, or it's just on the Jamboard. Let me share my screen. I think they, one of them was about, there you can see it, one of them was about the hashtag, but I think we start on the left-hand side. Do you think people, the sector, are ready to hear these personal stories of harm? So you were talking about, in terms of different acts of resistance, they can be quiet, they can be loud. I guess it involves people getting to the point where they have to open themselves up so much to be able to share whatever it is they need to share. What do you think about this question?
I'm torn. I think that our sector is really comfortable, actually, with stories of harm. I've really reflected at times we're more comfortable with stories of suffering and harm, particularly from the communities we serve, than we are with hearing about resilience, about care, about love, about protection that's happening in those same places. There's almost a voyeurism that happens, and I think many of us felt even in that beautiful opening of spotlighting stories of what happened. I mean, a lot of these were about sexual assault that came up from Me Too, but also after BLM, right? Of people who were owning up to personal experiences. But were people ready to hear and humanize who is behind those stories? That's where I'm wrestling at the moment. And like in the report, we include some testimonies. One of the things I've been pushing back a lot is that it continue to be asked, could we connect individuals to those who gave the testimonies, right? Like, can we reveal the identities of people? I continue to be asked this in my work and interaction with different leaders, and I say no. If you cannot find in your network people who have experienced harm, if you can't build enough trust for someone to tell you something like this story, you have a problem. You aren't doing the groundwork. So I would say that the fact that that groundwork isn't happening, that to me makes me think we aren't really ready. So it's important, I guess, we see both sides of this, that we are a sector that loves voyeurism of pain and suffering, but that doesn't mean we're ready to actually understand and recognize what that means and begin to take it on board so we can change at times. What do you think, Nabila?
Yeah, that's the thing. I think the thing is, a lot of people, a lot of people ask me, not within NANSHE obviously, but whenever we talk to other organizations or like when we were going through sessions with the Echoing Green Fellowship, and even with donors, donor governments. Like recently, we spoke to the British government and the Dutch government, and so they said, like I said, it's one thing about listening and hearing the stories of harm, but it's because women, especially like survivors, they do want a place to share. It is something even lawyers have told me, because we are connected to a lot of lawyers. Lawyers say that sometimes their clients ask them to be connected to other survivors. So survivors themselves, people who are going through themselves the experiences, they want to share, right? But for me, it's beyond that sharing, like what happens after that stories of harm. So I think it's beyond being ready. Maybe they're not ready to do anything with that. So for example, ICRC's response to the British government was that, oh yeah, they listened to the stories. This is actually in the report of the British government. Is that, oh yeah, we listened to the stories of the people who reported, and then as a result, they say, or they claim that now we have less reporting. I'm sorry, but that's not effective then, because if your process of listening has been effective and that you have not created any more harm, there would be highest number of report, right? Because the highest number of domestic violence report in the world is in Finland. Not because there are more violent men in Finland, but it's because there are more empowered women in Finland, because they trust the system when they go and report that they're not going to be, turned away, or they're not going to be harmed in the process of reporting, like I was when I reported. So I think it's beyond hearing the stories. It's what they are willing to confront after hearing the stories, and that I'm not so sure, especially given all of the examples that I just shared with IFRC and CRC.
Yeah, that's a really important piece. Thank you both. I'm just going to quickly ask Desiree, I don't know if you're still here. I think I saw your hand up, and I just want to check if you wanted to ask it or something.
Hi, thank you so much. First, I want to say, Nabila, I'm so sorry for what you went through. It's beyond aggravating. It's rage-inducing. But I think to the point about the stories about harm, one of the things that I've experienced in the work that I do in international development is, well, on a couple different levels. One, white saviorism is a hell of a drug, right? And so I think sometimes the concept of, oh yeah, that's terrible, but I'm not doing that. I'm actually helping people. So I think on one hand, it's like, well, I'm for some people in the sector, they hear these stories and think that they couldn't be the cause of this harm. But on another level, I've experienced folks in organizations, when they do hear these stories of racism, like marginalization, abuse, violence, is they view those as extremes, right? And that these are not the day-to-day of many people working in development. And so it's more of a question than a comment, but what is it? What more can we do? What more can you do to help people see that this isn't an aberration, that this is the status quo?
Yeah, I think that's a really great reflection. And one thing I've been pondering a lot is in our focus on trying to bring attention to structural factors for this kind of inequity, have we lost the equally important focus on the interpersonal? And for a lot of people in their everyday, yes, there are structural factors, but actually you can visibly I can personify who enacted abuse on me. It wasn't just that my contract said certain conditions, it was also that there was an HR manager, right, who asked me to sign. So bringing these two things together, because we've been denied the structural aspect, part of where I am and what I'm wrestling with a lot is like, how do we bring the interpersonal and the everyday also into the discussion? It is not that the structural isn't important, is that you need both pieces to understand, because that's where I'm also seeing people check out. And I mean, in terms of like decolonized MSF right now, we have some actions focused on MSF's photography at the moment. And a lot of the response that you're describing reflects what some staff have said, like, oh, I didn't make those photos personally. Well, dude, they're out there. In fact, they're horrible photos. They're photos that actually exhibit violence in itself, and they are literally for sale because somebody has been negligent with licensing. This is horrendous. We're all responsible. Why do I feel responsible? And I'm not even working there at MSF, and yet you are employed and you feel no responsibility. I think that's exactly the point of how do we begin to unpack that. It's really going to be the next struggle of resistance, I think, if we're going to move to a new phase from what came out of like 2 years ago. I think that is the battle you're describing, Desiree.
Thank you so much. I'm going to jump in here. We have a couple of minutes left, and we're not going to get to all of the questions. But what I want to ask both of you, just to leave us with before I wrap up, is what is your one piece of advice for someone who is resisting and potentially, you know, has been resisting for a while? I'm not going to say any more, but what's your one piece of advice for both of you?
I'll go first. For me, it's really important to seek support of other people. Like when I first started whistleblowing, it was very, very lonely, and it felt this incredible weight lifted off me when I found my co-founder Priyanka, and then when NANSHE grew, and then, you know, I was connected to another survivor and with Monica. But even within, and I never felt that when I was resisting in IFRC, in the UN, in IPPF. I always did it like alone. You know, whenever I reported, I just like, okay, I reported, and then I did that. Or, you know, if I wrote an email to my boss, and then, like, you know, if I sought psychosocial support, or I never really talked about it. I never really sought the support of colleagues or people within the same sector. But I started doing that later on, just before prior to, you know, finding NANSHE. And because of that support, NANSHE was founded. You know, so I think that would be, for me, the support, that the advice is that, you know, seek support or seek like-minded people, because it's super necessary when there are days when Monica is down, you know, feeling frustrated about some processes. I'm like affected, or you know, some days when I'm still triggered. When I was when she was shortlisted for the Echoing Green Fellowship, and my profile was everywhere out there being published, my perpetrator checked out my LinkedIn profile, my new LinkedIn profile, which obviously, even though I'm, you know, pretty much have you know, moved on from that, I was still very much triggered, and I had to like be on the phone with my boyfriend at the time for like 2.5 hours, you know, dealing with that. So having support is really, really important.
Thank you. Monica?
I think it is nurturing ourselves and our networks. It's really easy. In fact, I'd say it's ingrained in the sector to try to go for the big things, right? Like, let's go after poverty. Let's go after climate crisis. But unlearning the dynamics that this sector has trained us in, and actually investing in ourselves and those around us, I think is the biggest advice. Like, if you can't change an entire organization, because probably many of us are not even leaders in the kind of role we have those resources, we certainly can change the relationships we have with one another. And I will say this again, and I think this is going to be a big part again of the next phase, is as A lot of the revolutionary concepts have been commodified as they've been weaponized. We're really going to be looking for who we can trust amongst ourselves. And we already see that, right? In a lot of the movements of the BLM Foundation, how money was used, no white saviors, having a white co-founder who's gone after the other Black African co-founders. This will be part of the future. So really investing with one another, calling each other in, doing the work is the base. Doesn't matter if you have a fancy action or not. What matters is, do you have the base? If you have the base, I think then everything else can follow. So that would be what I'd say. Invest in your base and in yourself.
Thank you both so much. I just want to take a moment and honor both of you for sharing everything that you've been through and continue to work through, because this is never done, is it? And the support that you've shown each other is incredible. And thank you for sharing all of the work of NANSHE and decolonizing MSF. It's inspiring, so necessary, and really needs to be supported. So I hope everyone here is going to support